With the King Mog rework, we're getting some pretty powerful free units for you guys to get your hands on. The first one was Gentiana, who could hold her own as a mage in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, and now we have Immortal Knight Garland. So we're going to be looking at Immortal Knight Garland for you guys, what he specializes at, what he's really about, and how you're going to want to go about building him and the sort of utility that you're going to want in your party when trying to use Immortal Knight Garland. First and foremost, he's going to be a big limit burst damage chain finishing character. That's really what he specializes in. You're going to want to have someone to build a chain up for you so you can finish with him, and he can put out some pretty impressive numbers out there with his limit burst when we're going over his strengths as well as the sort of gear that you want to be putting on your Immortal Knight Garland. First of all, his TMR is the Knight of Chaos, 50% attack and 25% limit burst gauge fill rate. This will also proc his trustability. Keep that in mind when we get back down to it. His super TMR is the Cornelia Knight Armor, which you can get from the event as well for free. 32 attack, heavy armor piece with auto refresh, as well as a little bit of defense and spirit. So if you are a brand new player at FFBE, both of these things will be very, very, very strong for you. In addition to having possibly Immortal Knight Garland being your damage dealer of choice if you're on a fresh account. Moving into his actual skill set and abilities and equipment selection, let's look at his equipment selection here. He has swords, great swords, katanas, axes, hammers, and flails. He's going to first and foremost want to be using a two-handed weapon. So typically these are going to be your great swords. There's an axe out there that's a super TMR if you pick it up from Ignacio that's actually incredibly powerful for Immortal Knight Garland, but you're going to be wanting some sort of very strong two-handed weapon because he is a true double-hand character. So you're not looking at just your highest attack, you're looking at whatever the highest attack two-handed weapon you have available for most encounters. His armor selection here, he has no hats, but he does have helmets, light armor, and heavy armor. He can wear shields, but he's going to be using a two-handed weapon, so no shields for this guy. Now, he does have a lot of abilities here. First and foremost, he has Chaos Regeneration. It is a 4-turn cooldown available on turn 1. It's going to heal him for 6,000 HP split over 3 turns, so 2,000 HP a turn. And it's going to give a multiplier increase to Revenge of Chaos by 1.0 and a 2.0 multiplier increase to Chaos Slicer. These are his two go-to damage dealing skills when you're not using his limit burst. He is primarily an absolute mirror of equity chainer. He does have some other chaining frame families, as you can see here with Quake, Stardust Ray, Flood, and Tornado, with the different Fiend of the Wind skills for Earth, Fire, Water, and Wind. You're not really going to be using these skills to do damage though, but he does have some nice 70% elemental resistance buffs you can apply to your team, sort of like Onion Knight used to do back in the day and still can do today. So he's got a 70% lightning resistance buff, ice resistance buff, fire resistance buff, and earth resistance buff. Outside of using those for the different resistance buffs every once in a while, you're not going to be using these for damage. Now, he does have Dark Spiral Plus here, which is his 75% in peril attached to a low multiplier chain finishing skill. He also has access to Rumbling Darkness, which is going to allow you to imbue him with the dark element so you can take advantage of the different dark and perils that he has access to, like we just talked about with Dark Spiral. Now, Rumbling Darkness is a lower multiplier, 4.8, so very, very, very low for today's standards. Also gives him a 100% attack buff for 5 turns, and then does the all-important add dark element to physical attacks for 5 turns to the caster. This is also an absolute mirror of equity chaining frame skill, so you can use this as you go to do damage with your chains. You can throw this in there as your first attack, get the dark element, do the dark damage, and then the rest of your attacks will be doing dark element afterwards. He has a Thundaga and Flare. These aren't magic attacks. You're not going to use them. They're kind of in there for funsies, I guess, but you're not really going to use them in there. He does have Chaos Impact as an absolute mirror of equity skill, 6-star form here. It's a little bit backloaded, 5.5 times multiplier on that final hit, 1.0 multiplier spread in the first 7 hits there. And then he ends his 6-star form with Double Chaos here, which allows you to dual cast all of his skills except for 2 of them, which is Emergence of Chaos and Chains of Rebirth. Now, speaking of these 2 skills, this is going to be 2 of his cooldown skills he gets in his 7-star form, and these skills are all very, very good. So Emergence of Chaos is a 6-turn cooldown available on turn 1. It gives him a 200% attack and defense buff for 5 turns to the caster, and these buffs cannot be dispelled, which is pretty awesome. It's also going to give him a full limit burst gauge. It's going to unlock unlock his triple cast called Triple Chaos for 5 turns, and it's going to do 40% of your HP in damage to yourself, so you're going to have to heal that back up a little bit after you use this skill. But all in all, very strong. It's going to make him quite a bit more tankier on the defense side, give him that nice 200% attack buff, and then set you up for chain finishing on the next turn. And then after that, you can start using your triple cast to build up your limit burst gauge by generating limit burst crystals and doing some more damage that way. The cooldown skill that you can triple cast and dual cast is going to be Revenge of Chaos. It's a 3-turn cooldown available on turn 3. It is just his best chaining damage delay move. He can chain Absolute Mirror of Equity. It's the stuff that you do when you're not limit bursting with him, and they aren't that crazy of a multiplier, even with all the different multiplier buffs that he has, which are a couple of them from his passives. And then, like we talked about with the first cooldown skill, he gets at level 1 Chaos Regeneration with the 1 and 2 times multiplier increases here for his different skills. They don't even break a 20 times multiplier. So nothing super good here with these skills, but you'll be able to eke out a little bit of damage, but that's not his primary function. His primary function is a limit burst chain finisher. Then his final skill here is Chains of Rebirth. It is a very lengthy 20-turn cooldown available on turn 1. It's going to remove all status effects from all enemies, inflict all status ailments on them, which isn't really that big of a deal because all bosses for the most part are immune to these things, but it also does have a pretty hefty 70% attack, defense, magic, and spirit break for 3 turns to all enemies, and it can also have a 90% stop if you're trying to get some stops off with this character in the arena. But you can use him as an emergency breaker. It's not his primary role. This is the only break that he really has for you that's a high like this, and it's just something that you're going to have in your back pocket when trying to utilize this character. Maybe something you can do with him after you chain finish and you need to break, and then you can chain finish with him the turn after that if you have a team party that can set him up. Now, as we move into his passives here, he has 25% attack with a great sword into Helm, 20% attack and spirit passive, 20% dark resistance, defense and MP 30%, dark resist 30%. He does have 50% human killer, which is pretty awesome because a lot of the enemies in the game at endgame are human, so it's going to help him out there by quite a bit against those characters. More defense passives, limit burst gauge 2 per turn, help him get his limit burst off, 5% MP recovery, 20% attack, defense, and HP, 20% there, and then once your HP drops below 80%, you'll get a small buff of 120% to your attack and defense for 2 turns. So nothing super crazy there, but he does have a nice little self buff. That's usually always going to be up, especially when you utilize his 1 cooldown skill. You're going to get that 200%, so it doesn't really matter that you get this 120 from this passive here. He does have Corrupted Knight though, which is 20% attack, 30% HP, and then 100% passive true double hand. He gets a counter attack called Warmonger, which we'll go over, 25% high tide for that limit burst gauge generation. His trust ability here, which is going to be pretty easy to activate. He does have that nice material you guys get your hands on too with a 50% attack and 25% limit burst gauge fill rate. If you have that on, or you have a super TMR on, either or, you're going to get 30% attack, HP, and MP, and then 50% additional true double hand. So that's going to be very, very strong for him, especially if you're just trying to build up an account with some new true double hand gear. He's going to be pretty easy to cap that true double hand off for the most part. He does have Unending Chaos as a passive, 40% attack and defense, as well as 20% HP, and then once again 2 more limit burst gauge crystals per turn for him there. 20% spirit passive, and then his final passive here, the Tightening the Chains of Time. It gives him 50% passive limit burst damage. Then he gets multiplier increases, although small, 0.5 to 1.0 for his various different skills, including his main AT chaining frame skills. He also gets a 100% counter chance increase. That's for his Warmonger counter. His Warmonger counter is a simple 150% attack buff, but it also is going to give him triple chaos once again. So this is going to be nothing you can really depend on to happen, but as we get into more and more of these fights where your team's getting hit by unavoidable damage, this is going to give you an opportunity to counter with this to unlock that triple cast for 2 turns, and it's going to be 60% counter rate because it's 30% passive, but he does have that 100% counter chance increase. It's going to be 60% to counter with this Warmonger. His triple cast is the same sort of thing as his dual cast, everything but Emergence of Chaos and Chains of Rebirth. And then Chaos Slicer, which is the skill that is unlocked by using True Soul of Chaos, is going to do basically a little bit more damage than his other previous Absolute Mirror of Equity skills. This is base 2.0 in the first 7 hits versus the base 1.0 from the previous skill, and this is going to be 7.5 backload on that final hit instead of, I believe it was a 5.0 5.0, 5.5 from Chaos Impact. So there's just a better version of Chaos Impact that you'll get from using the True Soul of Chaos. He does have a little bit of magic, Kiraga, Blizzaga, and Faraga, but we're not really doing that here. And then we get to the main thing about him, his Limit Burst. Not only does it unlock Chaos Slicer that we just talked about, but it also does a hefty amount of damage. You're going to want to max this out if you are using Garland. It is the thing that you're using him for. As you can see, at level 1, it gives you a 20% Limit Burst damage bonus, and it's a 12.75 times multiplier with ignore 50% defense. If you max it out, which you're going to want to, it's a 50% Limit Burst damage buff for 1 turn, and then a 20 times multiplier, ignore 50% defense. So it's going to be a base 40 times multiplier on his Limit Burst, and it also gives him a 50% Limit Burst damage buff for 1 turn to the caster. This is the turn that you use it, so you're always going to get that 50% Limit Burst damage buff applied, and it's going to affect the Limit Burst as you use it because it gets applied beforehand. So he's got 50% passive, 50% buff from this, so he's got the buffs covered as well, and he's just going to hit things really, really, really hard. He basically can do as much damage. A full Super TMR Garland does the same amount of damage as a full Super TMR Regina does with their Limit Bursts up and their killers and all of that good stuff, and the character's built identically. Even though he only has a 50% damage to his Limit Burst buff compared to Regina's 120%, they actually do literally like within 1% of each other in the damage. Now, the main difference between characters like Immortal Knight Garland and other characters such as Regina and King Rain is that Garland's Limit Burst is a one-hit skill, whereas the other ones are chaining varieties of characters. So it's a plus and a minus. It's a plus because it's a chain finisher and it's a one-hit, so it's very, very easy to get the 4.0 multiplier maximum when using True Soul of Chaos, whereas, King Rain and Regina, usually those characters are building their own chains, so their multipliers aren't going to be that 4.0, so you can eke a little bit more damage out on this one hit. The detriment or the downside to that is you're going to have someone else build that chain for you, and that's really what's going to determine whether or not you can utilize Immortal Knight Garland to his fullest potential. You're going to want to have some supports or some tanks to chain together to build that chain up for him pretty much every other turn. Pretty much the opposite of something like Regina used to be, where she would chain her Limit Burst and then you would need to chain for her so she could chain finish Regina Cannon. Garland's going to be the other way around, where he can chain on his off turns fine with his Absolute Mirror of Equity chaining frame skills to do a little bit of damage, and then when you want to do that big daddy damage, you're going to want to build a chain for him and finish, and he can do a crazy amount of damage. So you're going to want to have TLDR for the newer players out there. Two-handed weapon, even something as simple as like the Lionheart, is going to be very, very strong for Immortal Knight Garland out there. You're going to want to focus on, as always, getting the right killers from your Espers and your at least one open materia slot for Demon Killer, Man Eater Plus, Beast Killer, whatever it is that you're going up against, at least one materia slot for that. And then you're going to want to just focus on Limit Burst damage, attack percent, and True Double Hand for the rest of your stats there to max out your Immortal Knight Garland. He is a very fantastic character for you guys out there who are just starting accounts. He could be your go-to damage dealer for a while, especially if you have been pulling for tanks and supports and stuff that last a long time. You can get in there with Garland if you've been pulling some of the top tier tanks. Maybe you got Warrior of Light, CG Charlotte, Myra, Lena, whoever it is in there, mix and match. You can use these different characters, Sylvie, Lid, and Fina, to allow anyone to chain together on your team and fit Immortal Knight Garland quite nicely into your team comp. He's not the most OP thing in the game, especially if you're a veteran player. You're not gonna drop whatever your best damage dealer is right now. You're not gonna drop your CG Noctis. You're not gonna drop you just pulled for White Lily, Dark Fiend, or anything of that nature, and just drop them and use Immortal Knight Garland because he's that much better. But he can do some insanely good damage, especially with some top tier TMR. So if you're out there as a veteran player and you just like Garland, you like Final Fantasy 1, you have all the super TMRs in the world, you want to go play around with him, he can do some really, really cool things. His best weapon, in my opinion, by far, if you're talking full super TMR builds, Ignacio's Axe works wonders on him. We finally found a character to use Ignacio's super TMR on, because not only is it a two-handed weapon, but the variance on the axe is average 1.5. It's got built-in fire on it, so you just need someone to fire Imperil for him. And he does, just like every other character in the game, benefit greatly, even though he does have his own imbues and imperils. If you have someone to imbue and imperil for your Immortal Knight Garland, for any other character in the game, It's going to allow you to do faster and quicker damage and have bigger imperils and eke out just that much more damage from your Immortal Knight Garland. So Final Fantasy 1 veteran players out there, you're going to be able to have a good time with Garland if he was one of your favorite characters. Newer players are going to have a good time with Immortal Knight Garland as well. He could possibly be one of your better damage dealers out there with the insane burst damage that he can do with his limit burst is going to help you guys out a lot. When I say insane burst damage, a newer player, if I had a character like Immortal Knight Garland coming into FFBE and I've been playing for a month, 2 months or whatever, I didn't have anything like this. We didn't, we had to script and scrape. This is a good character out there if you can utilize and learn how to utilize a character like Immortal Knight Garland. So if you want to see more stuff like this, guys, you know what to do. Hit that subscription button, notification bells on, ring-a-ling-ding, bringing in the new year with the Final Fantasy 1 love, Immortal Knight Garland, CG Warrior of Light, and the New Year bundles, guys. So if you missed those videos and you want to check them out, be sure to do so. Until then, guys, thank you so much for the support. I'll see you guys in the next one and on the stream. Take care, guys.